I'm Nina Shea. I direct the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, where I'm also a senior scholar. And we're here today to discuss the repression of Hong Kong and the rise of a pro-freedom hero, Jimmy Lai. And I have two experts with me who will be discussing the various aspects of both of those points, the religious freedom suppression and Jimmy Lai's case. Beijing is systematically working to absorb Hong Kong under its communist rule in violation of the 1997 agreement with Britain to respect Hong Kong's separate political, economic, and social system. Since the Chinese Communist Party imposed the national security law in 2020, sweeping law, we have seen Hong Kong has seen free speech, free press, freedom of assembly and association, other democratic freedoms, the rule of law, and due process rights being systematically curbed. There's mounting evidence that shows that the CCP recently has begun to harness, just in the last 2 or 3 years, has begun to harness religious communities, aligning them with the CCP's, the Chinese Communist Party's Sinicization policy, through which it tightly restricts religious practice, religious leaders, and religious teachings on the mainland. Hong Kong's Jimmy Lai is now before a court with 100% conviction rate under the national security law, accused of charged with criticizing the government, the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, and subversion. He is the founding owner and columnist of Hong Kong's Apple Daily Media. He is a self-educated entrepreneur who made a vast fortune in Hong Kong, its free market system. And despite the crackdown, he courageously chose to stay in Hong Kong to defend the freedoms that he and others, so many others, have benefited from and enjoyed in Hong Kong. And his arrest followed swiftly the imposition of the national security law. He has been held already for 3 years in prison, in jail, on various charges, and he's now facing a possible life sentence. So with me today to address these issues, I'm very delighted to introduce two experts. Bill McGurn, who is the member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal and writes a weekly column, Main Street, at the Wall Street Journal. Bill was a speechwriter for President George W. Bush, and he was based in Hong Kong for most of the 1990s for the Wall Street Journal and the Far Eastern Economic Review. Moreover, Bill is the godfather of Jimmy Lai and probably knows him better than anybody else in the United States. Also in our discussion today, we have Francis Hui, who was the first political activist to be granted political asylum in the United States. In December 2023, she had the distinction of having a $1 million Hong Kong bounty put on her head by Hong Kong authorities. She is also the author of a new report called Hostile Takeover, the CCP and Hong Kong's Religious Communities, which was published by the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, And that report can be found on their website at www.thecfhk.org. So Bill, I'd like to start with you. Jimmy Lai the man, you know him better than probably anybody in this country. Can you share with us what he is like, what motivates him, what is his situation now, and what it has been?
Well, I first met Jimmy in the 1990s. I was working for the Far Eastern Economic Review. It's kind of an economist for Asia. And I was struck, Jimmy had a chain of clothing stores called Giordano. And it was kind of like a Gap or an LL Bean. They sold brightly colored clothes, good quality at a reasonable price. And it was the first time someone tried to market to the middle class. In that sense, he was a real pioneering entrepreneur. Before that, you could get, designer labels a lot cheaper than, say, Europe or the US, or stuff in the streets, but not a lot for the middle class. So we did a story on him. And my boss came back and said, Jimmy claims to be the only guy who's read all of Hayek. And of course, we were all Hayek aficionados. For shorthand, Hayek was like Milton Friedman, a pro-free market, but his books are more philosophical than technical. So we kind of bonded over that. We had lunch, but what really brought us together is Jimmy's wife, Teresa, and my wife, Julie, really grew close. And over the years, his family, he became like a brother. And I was there when all his kids were born, watched them grow up. So I watched this man who shared the principles sometime before 1997, like a week before the handover. I asked him if he wanted to convert, and he said no. He believed in all religion, and if he chose one, he would be favoring one over the other. He couldn't be effective. Okay, that was his reason. I asked, he said no. A week later, still before 1997 handover, he said, I want Christ in my life. And he decided to convert, and he talked to the cardinal. And a week after the handover, he had become a Catholic. Now, Nina, I'm ashamed to say, at the baptism in the cathedral, when he became a Catholic, I wondered how much Jimmy really believed. He knew a lot of Catholics. As Francis will tell you, Catholics are pretty prominent in the pro-democracy movement. He respected the Catholic Church. His wife was Catholic, would be happy. So there are a lot of social reasons to become Catholic. But I'll say I'm ashamed of those thoughts now. Getting his letters from prison, he's very serious. He considers himself a religious artist. He sends me art all the time. I'll hold up an example here once. He used to do it like this on the back of letters that he wrote to me from prison. And he takes it very seriously. So his faith not only sustains him, it sustains his wife and family. It's a bond. And of course, he has that bond with a lot of people. And one of his big friends, Cardinal Zen, at a time when everyone else is abandoning Jimmy, people who are at his dinner table don't want to be seen with him. Cardinal Zen walks into the courtroom and sits right next to Jimmy's wife. It's really extraordinary.
Well, let's talk for a minute about the courtroom. So Jimmy's on trial. He's been in prison, though. He's been in Stanley Prison for 3 years. Where does his legal case stand, his legal situation? And how long do you think it's going to go, and where do you see this ending? And does Jimmy know about it? Does Jimmy acknowledge that he is really in deep trouble?
Yeah, he's been in jail about 3 years. And he was originally charged and convicted of some minor crimes like attending a demonstration. And then he was convicted of trumped up business fraud charges. Now he faces charges of sedition and foreign collusion under the national security law. I don't think there's any doubt about the outcome. I mean, one of the ministers bragged about the 100% conviction rate under the national security law. So, but anyone who thought Jimmy would leave, he owns homes in Paris, Tokyo, Taiwan. He could have gone anywhere and saved himself, but he just wouldn't do that. He always says, Hong Kong made me rich, gave me everything I am. How could I turn my back on it? And anyone who would thought he might leave just doesn't know the man.
Yeah, Francis, speaking of the national security law, you talk about how you write about how religious freedom is deteriorating. And it seems like this one law, this one pernicious law in a single stroke has undermined so many freedoms. Religious freedom has been relatively intact and, compared to, say, the right to demonstrate and free speech. That was shot down very early on after the law was imposed, even before the law was imposed. So can you talk about, tell us about how the national security law works? I mean, you really drilled down on it, on religious freedom, to see how it is really eroding that right.
Mm-hmm. Well, so China imposed a national security law in Hong Kong in 2020, and I guess the biggest goal of it is to stifle dissent, right? It has destroyed freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of press. It's a very vaguely written law that pretty much applies to the whole civil society. You see groups disbanded, and a lot of them, people are silencing, censoring themselves. And now we see a pattern of using that law to also stifle religious freedom in Hong Kong. I think the most directly demonstrated example is obviously persons of faith being targeted for their advocacy for human rights and freedom. I don't think, a lot of them do not, well, the priority of it is the advocacy for democracy, but a lot of them have included in their testimonies that their faith is what led them to be standing out in the streets and participating in social movements. We see, again, we're talking about Jimmy Lai. He's a Catholic. Cardinal Zen, he was also arrested under the national security law, although not charged. But we see that, the government is using this law to target persons of faith. And a Protestant pastor was actually sentenced to 13 months in jail in 2022 under the law for sedition and seditious speech. And so he became kind of like the first clergy or the first religious figures to be sentenced in jail. I think that's the most direct example. But there are also another more obscure but widespread effect is the chilling effect that has created in the entire society. People are now prone to self-censorship, and that includes priests, right, clergy, when they are giving sermons, and also teachers in faith-based schools when they're teaching about religious education.
Let me ask you about that. The Christian schools, you point out in your report, really own a lot of the educational infrastructure in the whole region, in the whole Hong Kong. And they are also directly affected by that national security law. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so in the national security law, it actually requires every school to implement national security education, no matter what kind of school you are, public school, private school.
Which is intimidating in and of itself, just to be reading of this warning constantly and being lectured about it.
Yeah, the education, they published, the curriculum, a guideline of the education. Basically, it's to infuse values, socialist values, patriotic values into textbooks. And every subject in teaching in the school has to abide with that rule. And so in my report, during my research, I interview teachers who actually taught in secondary schools, and they were religious studies teachers. And a lot of them have told me, yeah, even with religious studies, there's nothing to do with the CCP. We have to try to find a way to put in those values in their subject, in their teaching. And also, every school are required to display this PRC national flag in their school hall.
Show patriotism.
Right.
What about a Sinicization? This is a Xi Jinping, President Xi Jinping of China's policy articulated in 2015 to unite religious communities around the party. And the control over oversight of religions then became the responsibility of the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party. So it really was incorporated into the party, religions on the mainland. And so it's far more draconian there, it seems, on the mainland. But it does have an effect now in Hong Kong. You're seeing implementation, maybe a steady, more gradual implementation of Sinicization. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so you mentioned about the Sinicization concepts being introduced first in 2015 by Xi Jinping, and the whole idea is to infuse and require religious groups to align with the party's priorities and their values, socialist values. I think we're not seeing that a lot in the past. In Hong Kong, we're seeing it more. In China, children are banned from going to churches. In some regions, scriptures are being rewritten. And you now have to display Xi Jinping's portraits in some of the religious premises.
And by my count, there are 6 Catholic bishops who have been put in black jail since or punished since the agreement with the Vatican in 2018. And the Mission Society, the Pontifical Mission Society, says that there are 17 bishops altogether that are being punished or in black jails. And black jails are unofficial detention centers that afford absolutely no due process or even any definite sentence. It can be indefinite. And there's one bishop, Bishop Su, who has been imprisoned for 28 years now. He was imprisoned, he was jailed, arrested, and put away in 1996, and really hasn't been heard from since.
Well, Nina, I think you write a lot about Sinicization and the fact that it can be easily misinterpreted as enculturation or indigenization and some other people's words. But
it's far worse. It's very restrictive.
The concept of it is we're facilitating evangelism by adapting a religion into the indigenous culture, but Sinicization is more than that. As you said, they're putting people in jail, putting persons of faith in jail. They are banning people from going to church.
Surveillance cameras everywhere.
Exactly, and they're using them as a political tool to promote their own political agenda.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think
you're starting to see that in Hong Kong.
And I think it's important to remember China is an atheist regime. And the only reason that they're keeping religions around is that they wanted to use them as a political tool.
Right.
And in Hong Kong, they have been already using these communities to promote its political agenda, to even use some of these groups to further crack down on other religious communities.
Okay, so there are about 1,788 political prisoners in Hong Kong, according to the database right now. And Bill, I want to ask you again about Jimmy Lai in this context. These political prisoners, almost 2,000 of them at this point in Hong Kong alone, mostly are forgotten by the West, or at least their names are not known, and there is no real campaign or attempt to elevate them. except for Jimmy Lai. And he has become the face, I think, for the whole problem of political prisoners and repression. What do you say?
Yeah, I think Jimmy would tell you the same thing about the people, the other people locked up that don't have his name recognition or friendliness with Western reporters and politicians. He would always say, "Don't forget these people." And I think he thinks he stayed in Hong Kong to be with them, to choose sides. Same with Cardinal Zen. Cardinal Zen, as Francis mentioned, was not prosecuted on the national security charges. He was on these other charges of organizing a group without official regulatory permission. He's 93. He would love to go to jail. They don't know what to do with him because he says, if I go to jail, I'll be closer to my people, my flock. I'll be able to serve more of them. So I think we should never forget those people. I want to add a thing about the churches and Sinicization. I think what Francis said is absolutely right. And there are horror stories out of China, about churches being desecrated and portraits of Xi being put up where maybe the saints once were or something. That's really bad. In Hong Kong, it hasn't quite reached those levels, but they are trying to take over the schools. That's probably the Catholic Church's most significant contribution. They run so many of the schools. So many of Hong Kong's elite have gone through Catholic schools, and they're trying to take over the curricula. Look, the way I see it, Hong Kong is what it is, this great experiment, this great Chinese society, because one, it was free in trade, open to all foreigners coming in and trading and making people rich and so forth. So the economy was free and open to all things, banks from Japan, manufacturers from the US, all sorts of things. But religious freedom was free for largely the same reason. A lot of personnel, missionaries in different forms came. And as you know, Nina, the real test of religious freedom is corporate religious freedom. That is, a lot of people would go to China and see a church open and say, oh, China has religious freedom. No, it doesn't. They would permit services. They would try to control them, but permit the services. But the churches were not free to organize schools, give lessons, run clinics, do all the other work that it does. In Hong Kong, they do an extraordinary amount of work. Catholic Charities is the biggest social welfare organization in the territory. So I think this will be the next stone. I'm surprised they haven't yet gone after the, expelled or not granted a visa to a foreign priest or a pastor who wants to come in. But I don't, if Xi Jinping continues to do what he's doing, I don't think Hong Kong's going to be exempt.
Yeah, it's very dire in China. Just in January 2024, this year, Bishop Peter Shao was arrested in Hainan, and he was told to pack for all seasons because he was going to go to a black jail, unofficial detention, without any charge, without any trial, without any due process whatsoever, indefinitely. So this is continuing in China. We're not seeing that yet in Hong Kong. But I worry because the churches, China, as Francis points out, is starting to, the Chinese Patriotic Association is starting to, that's the government-controlled church infrastructure, is starting to exert domination over even the cardinal of Hong Kong, whom they refuse to call cardinal and call him bishop and refer to Hong Kong as our diocese. Hong Kong is not part of the Patriotic Church of China, has never been, but it looks like it may, there are even, as you point out, some voices, including, and I guess it was an Anglican minister who's calling for some kind of infrastructure like that to start registering churches. But I want to talk about the sharp contrast before, when you had Cardinal Zen speaking out and honoring these martyrs and prisoners in China, and now where the churches just seem to be conforming, the church leaders are conforming, saying absurd things like enculturation, which, Francis, you were just describing, is the same thing as Sinicization. That the Pope Francis's love for humanity is the same thing. It's just like President Xi's community for common destiny of mankind. That's his Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah. Cardinal Charles said that. Right?
That was Cardinal Chow.
Yeah.
So what do you make of this? Some of the priests that you quote have amazing insights into this, and tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I think you put it really very correctly, is that in the past we see that faith has been quite embedded in social issues. The Catholic Church in Hong Kong actually has this Justice and Peace Commission that focuses its work on caring about social issues, voicing out about the persecution in China's church. And now they have, after the national security law was implemented, there were multiple attempts to censor statements coming out from the commission. Then in 2022, they actually renamed the commission to broaden its scope, and they had their own reason to explain it, saying that it was to echo the merger of Vatican of the 4 previous commission. But then that Vatican's merger happened in 2017, so the timing of renaming the Hong Kong commission is odd. And I also found in my research that in their pamphlets, they actually removed concerns about human rights issues, advocating for the church in China, and speaking up on human rights issues. All of them were removed from the scope of work, and so it's obvious that they're trying to dilute its focus on these issues. And now I think you mentioned about my interviews with some of the priests in Hong Kong. I mean, everyone is very worried that in the future they would be forced to join the Catholic Patriotic Association. They don't have to right now, but the Vatican have already said that they are looking into setting up a bishop conference and a liaison office in China, which makes people wonder, maybe they will make it the case that the Patriotic Association in China will be legalized. And in that case, then Hong Kong priests would have to register with the Patriotic Association and be part of the Chinese bishop. I wanted to mention that one of the priests that I interviewed, he said that I can't cut up Jesus' arm and present that to people that is Jesus Christ himself. So, but now this is the situation in Hong Kong. They have to show selective truth. They have to avoid any sensitive topics. But in the Christian faith and Catholic faith,
like justice, for example, is a sensitive topic.
Yeah, and care about things around you, care for others, speak up against injustice. All these kind of things are quite embedded in our faith.
Well, Cardinal Chow has been taking groups over, arranged for groups, exchanges for, what some people call red education, student groups.
Brainwashing. Yeah.
Well, it's indoctrination of some kind, certainly, although he denies it.
Right.
Is he and the church, is the Vatican naive? Do they not know what's happening? What's unfolding, this absorption of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong church?
Well, I think we discussed this before. The answer is no. Right. When the 2019 movement happened, even the national security law came into effect, a Vatican envoy has started talking to missionaries in Hong Kong. about the China's impeding threats to religious freedom in Hong Kong, and he said Hong Kong is no longer the Catholic beachhead that it used to be.
As Bill was describing earlier.
Right,
yeah.
and they started to also moving files from Hong Kong to foreign countries because they see that China is coming.
To protect their archives and the people who came and talked about persecution.
Exactly, and so the advice from him apparently shows that the Catholic Church is aware of the problem and the situation. I think,
Well, I remember Cardinal Chow actually got a PhD in education from Harvard, and he wrote his thesis on how the schools have unique cultures. And in it, he talks about how the Christian schools, the Catholic schools in Hong Kong had a culture of human dignity, and they had to preserve that. And that was what was very distinctive, even though they educated many who were not Catholic in their schools. That was a major theme for everybody that was above and beyond the religion classes themselves. And I'm just wondering, maybe you both could jump in about whether Hong Kong, is there a culture of human dignity? Is it going to survive? Is there going to be anything Christian or religious about? And we haven't really talked about other non-Christian religions. Falun Gong certainly has been started to see some persecution and attacks.
The Muslim communities as well.
And the Muslim, but it's always striking to me because the government talks about how Christian churches had Western values and were leading these non-Chinese demonstrations and protests and criticism, but the Asian religions had complete freedom and were fine. And in fact, even if you look at Falun Gong, there is really it's very Asian religion. It's indigenous to China, maybe the only one that started in China, and it became very popular before it was crushed in the 1990s. But they won't tolerate it. I mean, it's considered an evil cult in China, and now it seems like it's going to go in that direction in Hong Kong as well, according to your report.
Yes, I think they are specifically targeting not just Falun Gong. I mean, Falun Gong itself has a lot of, included in their faith is that we speak up against the CCP, and so that's why. You can see why they were being targeted, but through media, state-controlled media, and Chinese think tanks, the government has started to single out Christian groups, especially Catholics. They have mentioned that Catholic, is among all other Christians, are the most most involved in social issues, social movements. They're most outspoken. There was actually a blue book published by a Chinese leading think tank in 2021, where they talk about, like the states of religions in Hong Kong, and they spent, I think they used like at least 14 pages talking about education, how Christian groups have basically encouraged students to participate in the 2019 movement, which in their eyes is a violent riots that took place in Hong Kong. And the Christian groups, Catholics, they are all responsible for that because they promote violent means and promote, encourage students to take to the streets. So they're targeting
I
the
think
faith.
it's that individual human dignity that really gets them, because what they want is what Xi Jinping says is, all breathe with the same breath and all unite around, the party and conform, conformity as a group. And in fact, that is being repeated now by, to my distress, by some Bishop Ha. You have a quote in your report about that, where he says parrots the exact same phrase of that mantra, that we must all breathe with one breath.
Yeah. So I think, again, this whole process of Sinicization of religion is to transform a religion into their versions of, CCP's version of religion, which that would be useful for them, and to control religions and control people's mind.
And it seems like the Christian leaders at this point are so intimidated by this, so frightened that they're midwifing this this cultural transformation.
Yeah, well, I will even be more blunt to say that they're now willingly, like they're volunteering themselves to say a lot of the things that are not needed. For example, right. you mentioned about clergies are now arranged to visit Beijing in coming years, which was I cover that in my report. This is not something. This is not something that the Vatican asked to do. It was a result of Cardinal Chao's trip to Beijing, and from my understanding, it was not asked. Like the Vatican didn't ask him to do this. Like it was voluntary.
So it's worse than silence. It's a more active.
And it's not just happening in the Catholic Church. All the religious communities in Hong Kong, they're all the leaders are pro-Beijing. And their leaders are even members of China's political conference. They're actually CCP officials now. And so you see, there are not a lot of people from other religions, like non-Christian religions, in social movements. They are actually there, but they don't really relate their faith into their participation because they don't see a leading voice from their religion. In social movements.
As a Hong Kong priest you quote says, religion is becoming irrelevant if it goes in that direction.
Yes.
And Bill, you knew Cardinal Zen. You know Cardinal Zen. He was very, very different, of course, when he was, I guess, free to talk. He's still free to talk. He still freely expounds his views on church teachings, but not so much anymore on government and Hong Kong, the crackdown going on in China.
Yeah.
Well, I think he finds a different way to speak. Cardinal Zen is a true hero. He was born in Shanghai. He knows China and knows Hong Kong well. And as I say, he was convicted of one thing. They're still holding that national security charge against him. And he was tried with 4 other people, so he doesn't want to get them in trouble. But he speaks because on Jimmy's trial, most people don't want to be seen with lies. He ambles into the court and takes a seat right next to Teresa Lai. So that's a statement that is shouting all over Hong Kong where he sides and what he thinks is right. And I'll say, it's connected with the Vatican's, I think, disastrous China policy, which Cardinal Zen was an outspoken critic.
That's right.
The fact that Cardinal Zen, who knows about China, is Chinese, was excluded from negotiations ought to tell you something. Yeah. Now, the new bishop, I think you can make a case. I don't agree with it, but you can make a case. We need to engage China and not enrage them over different things. That's fine. You can make that case, and that's the case the bishop makes or the cardinal makes now. But I think if you were going to do that, he's not mentioned Jimmy Lai, probably the most prominent Catholic in jail in China. He's not mentioned him, and you think you'd make backdoor outreach to him to say, I'm not going to do this in public, but I'm praying for you. It really leaves a bitter taste in a lot of Jimmy's friends' mouths that they don't see the church defending him. That's not surprising. The Pope hasn't defended Cardinal Zen. When he was asked a question, I think about a year ago, about Cardinal Zen getting in trouble with the law, he kind of implied, well, he asked for it.
Yeah. Okay, so we're almost out of time. I want to have a lightning round about, with all of us, about U.S. policy. What more should the U.S. be doing for religious freedom, for Hong Kong, for freedom, for Jimmy Lai at this time? So, Bill, go ahead.
Well, I have to say, the US and UK, a lot of the powers have been a lot better than I expected. They've denounced the trial as a sham, and different aspects of what Hong Kong is doing with the national security law. I think they need to follow that up. Every time you sit down with the Chinese trying to negotiate, say, landing rights for a Chinese airline in Des Moines or a port call somewhere in Seattle, anything they want, more visas, an expansion of a consulate, your answer ought to be Jimmy Lai. Only when it becomes more inconvenient. Now, I think Jimmy's going to be convicted. You know, the minister bragged of the 100% conviction rate before the trial started. But after China convicts him, you could make a case. It served your purpose. You sent the message. He's 75. He'll be 76 then. You know, keep in jail, risk having him die in jail. You should let him out now, and it'll make it easier for you. So I would like them to bring his name up as often as possible,
Okay.
and not to forget the other people in jail that have no champion, that are unknown in the West, and are in there for minor crimes. I mean, last thing I'll say, the national security law is supposed to be aimed at curbing foreign influence. Why are the targets always Hong Kong people, like some guy who played Glory to Hong Kong, an unofficial protest song, when the Queen died on his harmonica? And I think he got a 4-month sentence. It's absurd.
Yeah. Francis.
Well, I wanted to shine a light on the upcoming Article 23 legislation. The government has proposed this legislation, and they're now into this 1-month consultation period, which, you know, it's more like a way to inform us this is going to come to the city. The Article 23 is it seeks to fill in the loophole created under the national security law. It target foreign organizations, their activities in Hong Kong. By that, I think a lot of the small to medium scale church groups, the Catholic Church and foreign missionaries would all be affected. We don't know how they're going to use this law to go against religious groups, but having this law passed and imposed in Hong Kong would be a great threat to religious groups in Hong Kong. They are subject to legal prosecution, and they would
close
have to
the door, that, as Bill was saying earlier.
Well, take the case of Catholic Church in Hong Kong. They might have to stop their communication with the Vatican because it's a foreign state. So then you make the case of joining the Catholic Patriotic Association. They don't have direct communication with the Vatican. And I'm afraid...
In fact, you have to take a pledge as a member of the Patriotic Association, which all clergy are required to do in mainland China, to be independent of the Vatican.
Yeah, and I think, now again, we don't know how they're going to use this because it's another vaguely written law. But having this law here, they have, if they don't like what you're doing and they have targeted you, they have the law at their disposal to use that to threaten you and put you in jail. I think this is something the world, American government should pay attention to and to speak up, against it.
Good.
Another just a very short one, make good use of our sanction tools to hold bad actors accountable for violating religious freedom in Hong Kong. We have the the U.S. has all the sanctions authorized. They're authorized to use those tools.
Targeted sanctions.
It's already in the U.S. law that they can use.
Congressman Chris Smith has sponsored a new bill to target with sanctions Jimmy Lai's prosecutors.
Yes.
So I think that's a good start on that, and a good place to start. I also, for my recommendation, I'm to say that I think that there should be a way to honor Jimmy Lai and what he stands for. The people behind him who are in prison, whose names and faces are not well known. And that is by naming a street adjacent to one of the Chinese embassy buildings here in Washington.
Or the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices.
Yes, yeah, that's one of the buildings that's actually in the name of the Chinese government. And to name it after Jimmy Lai Way. And that is a tradition in Washington. We have Andrei Sakharov Way, and the various others from other countries named embassy streets, fronting them, named after their political prisoners or martyrs and political martyrs. And so I think that this would be a way to honor Jimmy Lai and all those in prison, and to keep his name before the public and the world to know who they are. So we're out of time. I want to thank our guests today, Bill McGurn, Francis Wei, and thank you all for tuning in.